and then following procedures from there when they may not be high enough to safely do that. So the objective is to get on the ground. It's not to fly a pattern. Standard pattern, we generally know what the standard pattern is. Fly across the runway, enter a downwind, turn on to final. That works if you've got altitude and if everything is going well. On the other hand, straight in may be far more appropriate. So don't tie yourself to flying the standard pattern. Tie yourself to getting on the ground safely.
Jay, what kind of ordnance is hanging in the wings there?
What's that?
It doesn't say that's ordnance under the wings there.
Yeah. I didn't spend a lot of time on this. Okay, you fly your pattern.
Now see that?
You enter the pattern,
That's
and all of a sudden,
after bombs. That's what they are.
all of a sudden you realize that you're getting too low. Do you continue with the pattern because that's the way you were taught? Cut the pattern short. Cut base before you get to the threshold. Make that turn. We've got 2,300 feet of runway here. Don't be afraid to use any or all of it. What's a 20-knot headwind going to do to you? You're on downwind. So stretch that downwind out. You're going to spend probably less time on downwind. It's going to go a lot quicker. You're going to get to the corner at the turn onto base leg higher or lower than you expect. Higher than you expect. You make that turn onto base, what's going to happen? Ground speed is going to be a little bit lower. You're going to be crabbing into the wind if you're paying attention. If you're not paying attention, you're going to continue getting blown downwind. And at that point, you're going to have a much longer final in front of you. What's going to happen on final with that 20-knot headwind?
Real slow ground speed.
Ground speed is going to be very slow. What's your glide angle going to do?
Much steeper.
It's going to be much, much steeper. If you are flying 60 knots, 5-knot descent, what's your ratio? Your glide ratio, 12:1. If you go into a 20-knot headwind, what does that do to that glide ratio? Well, you go from 60 to 40 knots over the ground, but you're still going down at 500 feet a minute, 5 knots. Your glide ratio just went to 8:1, just because of that headwind. So be prepared to cut that short. Now, the last thing to keep in mind with the wind, we keep additional airspeed up to compensate for wind. Why do we do that? What is wind shear, and how does that affect us? We're on final, 60 knots into a 20-knot headwind. Picking those numbers because it's easier to do the math. We're coming into that 20-knot headwind. What's our speed over the ground? 40 knots. How fast is that glider really moving? It's 40. It's going through the wind at 60, but its mass is actually moving at 40 knots. We've got 20 knots of headwind at 200 feet or so. What's going to happen to that headwind as we get closer and closer to the ground? It's going to drop off. It's going to fall. We're going to go from 20 knots to 10 knots, maybe even a little bit lower. What does that do to our airspeed? It's going to drop off. And in order to maintain that airspeed, what do we have to do? Pitch over. And as we go through that gradient, if we don't respond correctly, that's going to shift our touchdown point closer and closer away from the threshold of the runway. So keep in mind, what does a wind gradient do to you on landing? What does a wind gradient do to your performance on takeoff if you've got a tailwind and you do the opposite climbing up? And I think that's all I've got.
Thank you, Jay. So what I'm going to do now is talk about primarily Part 91 federal aviation regulations. The ones that you like, I put together. The ones I don't like was Dylan's contribution to this. 91.9 Civil Flight Manual Markings Placard Requirements. We always talk about OAR, or air inertia of an airplane. The basis of that is partly in 91.9, requiring flight manual. If there's no flight manual with the aircraft, placards, airspeed placards, weight and balance typically is there too. Data markings, data that is necessary for the safe operation of the aircraft must be in the aircraft. So you cannot take off unless you have placards for weight and balance, red line speeds, operating speeds, placards required regarding the spin capability, other limitations that may be in the aircraft, such as maximum speed for gear deployment and the flap speed. If you're a geek about this, you know that VA is maneuvering speed, VB is VNE is never exceeds speed, and we have rough air speed is, I think VB is actually rough air speed. V sub S is stall speed. Okay, well it depends, it's aircraft dependent. I think VRA is rough air speed for the deployments. Just kind of way of putting it. 91.203 talks about certification requirements, and so your aircraft has to have a current airworthiness certificate, and that must be displayed in the cabin or cockpit entrance so that both of the passengers and crew. I think that's for the most part. The registration certificate design that you displayed also must be in the aircraft. And you should check those before you fly to make sure you have the proper documentation in the cockpit. Medical certification. We don't need a medical certificate to fly a glider. However, you have to certify yourself to be capable of exercising the privileges of pilot command. So even though you don't need a valid medical certificate, you do need to be healthy. And the AOPA website has a very easily, so if you're a member of AOPA, even if you're not a member of AOPA, you can access their list of medications which are being supplied for flight. And that's a very, very handy resource. And so, just following up with this again, you do not need a medical certificate to fly a glider. However, you must be in a condition that would impair your ability to fly. One side note to this, I will mention that the light sport aircraft ruling that came down a few years ago, if you do, for light sport aircraft, you don't need a medical, you need a driver's license. However, if you did not pass your last FAA medical